In our new unit, we're going to focus on a new type of shape. So moving up from our three-sided triangles, we're moving on to four-sided quadrilaterals. Now, I'd like you to the best of your ability, copy the chart in front of you, and I'll go through each type of quadrilateral to give you a quick overview. So, any shape that has four sides that are closed and straight can be classified as a quadrilateral. So, in other words, it has to be a type of polygon, a word that we will talk about more in class. If a quadrilateral, a four-sided shape, happens to have two opposite sides that are parallel, then we call that a parallelogram. Its most defining feature is that the opposite sides are parallel. Again, a lot of this is going to be a review, but in geometry, we're going to add on a few new properties. So for instance, you might remember that opposite sides and opposite angles of a parallelogram are congruent. But did you know that the diagonals of that shape, like if we went from corner to corner, those are going to bisect each other? So new interesting property we can use in geometry. There are some special types of parallelograms down below. Rectangles are best defined as having 90-degree angles. So any shape that has 90-degree angles is a quadrilateral, and is a quadrilateral would be classified as a rectangle, which means a square also fits that definition because it has 90-degree angles. But a square also has another special property that defines it and makes it special, and that's that the sides are all the same. Again, this is a review, but it might interest you to know that a square is also not just a rectangle, but also a type of rhombus. Since a rhombus is just a parallelogram that has four congruent sides. So a square is kind of special. It fits into two different categories. Now, you might be wondering, how would I talk about more than one rhombus? Well, the plural is actually rhombi or rhombuses. You can use either. You may want to pause now. I'm going to move on to some other shapes and show you how all of these things are interrelated. But if you need more time to write all this down, just hit the pause button. So I mentioned that those were all special types of parallelograms. And the way this kind of works is that inside of the realm of quadrilaterals, there are different types of quadrilaterals that have special properties. Well, within parallelograms, there are types of parallelograms that have special properties. And so it's kind of like a Venn diagram where we have things overlapping each other. So where rectangles and rhombuses overlap, those would be squares because they have four 90-degree angles and they have four congruent sides. If something has just one or the other of those properties, then it would fall into either the rhombus box or the rectangle box. Now we have these other types over here, the kites and the trapezoids that we're going to talk about in a second, and they are not parallelograms. They do not have two sides opposite that are parallel. Trapezoids have one pair of parallel sides, and kites have no pairs of parallel sides. So to finish out our chart, we've got kites, trapezoids, and a special type of trapezoid called an isosceles trapezoid. A kite looks kind of like a kite, and its special property is that adjacent pairs of sides are congruent. So like the vertex at the top has two congruent sides coming from it, and the vertex at the bottom has two congruent sides attached to it. It's kind of like you take two isosceles triangles that aren't necessarily the same, and you stick them on top of each other. Now, a trapezoid has some similarities to a parallelogram because it has one set of parallel sides, but the opposite sides in between those do not necessarily have to be parallel. In fact, well, they can't be parallel, otherwise it would be a parallelogram. Trapezoids have some interesting properties when we start talking about the midsegments, and we'll get into that a little bit more in class. Fun fact, if you are in England, they will not call it a trapezoid, they will call it a trapezium. So if you're looking for things on the internet and you see trapezium, they're talking about trapezoids. Now, an isosceles trapezoid is a trapezoid where the two opposite sides that are not parallel are also congruent. And as a result, your base angles are going to be congruent. Your sides are obviously congruent. And then the diagonals, as a result, are also congruent. So some interesting properties when you have an isosceles trapezoid. Your job this unit is to memorize as many of these properties of quadrilaterals as you can, because the quicker and the more effectively you have memorized them, the more efficiently you're going to be able to solve problems. In order to solve a problem in this unit, you're going to need to be able to identify which quadrilateral we're talking about, the property that is required to solve the problem, and then apply that property to either write an equation or create a proof or something of that nature. So your task is to figure out the best possible way to memorize as much of this information as quickly as possible. Good luck!